In this lecture, I will introduce you to some of the main ideas of Karl Marx, hopefully correcting some misconceptions about how Marx's views of history and politics should be interpreted. More specifically, we will talk about Karl Marx as an Enlightenment thinker. What's common to Enlightenment thinkers is that they are all motivated by the idea of individual freedom as the highest good, and basing politics on scientific principles rather than appeals to custom, natural law, or religion, or even tradition, or anything else. As an Enlightenment thinker, Karl Marx was committed to science, that is, to a scientific theory of politics. If you read his attack on the utopian socialists, for example, it is all about attacking them for being unscientific in their thinking. It was all about rejecting sentimentalism or wishful thinking in trying to understand what was feasible and what was not feasible in politics. More specifically, Marx was committed to something called the materialist conception of history, or, to use another of one of his rather impenetrable phrases, to the idea of dialectical materialism. You might say, well, what is dialectical materialism? This comes from the idea first articulated by the German philosopher Friedrich Hegel that history moves in a kind of zigzag of fits and starts. Hegel's famous terms were thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The thesis is a change, so you get the transition from serfdom to a market-based society. Then you get resistance to that market-based society. You get a new working class. Then that working class becomes the agent of a new change that will produce its own antithesis and new synthesis. So history doesn't go in a straight line, but it goes in a direction. It goes forward in some sense. And Hegel's idea had been that history eventually reaches an ending point, and he thought the ending point was the Prussian state of his day. He thought all of history was evolving toward the supreme highest point of the Prussian state of his day. Marx turned this idea on his head, saying, well, yes, history goes in this kind of zigzag direction of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and then synthesis becomes the new thesis, and so on. And yes, it has an endpoint, which for Marx was a communist utopia, but it's not driven by ideas. It's not driven by ideas at all. Instead, it's driven by material interest. So that's why Marx's view is sometimes called dialectical materialism. It's driven by material interest. Or, as Bill Clinton put it in his 1992 campaign, it's the economy, stupid. The basic idea behind materialism is that ideas, culture, beliefs, all of that stuff is a superstructure. It's not really important. What is important is the economic base, so that economic interests drive everything over time. And if you want to understand how a political system works, you better understand the economic system. You have to understand what forces are in the economy and what the tensions and possibilities are within the economy before you can understand anything else about politics. Now, let's turn to what Marx thought about capitalism. We will discuss this in a lot of detail, focusing both on the micro and the macro theory that Marx gave of capitalism. But in this lecture, I want to stress the general ideas that Marx proposed. So, was Marx against capitalism? He thought capitalism was the most innovative and dynamic mode of production that has been ever dreamed up, and there was no way you could even think about a socialist or a communist society developing unless you had capitalism first. So Marx would have had absolutely no sympathy for the Russian Revolution, which was done in a peasant society, or for the Chinese communist system. He would have said that they were completely premature, because capitalism is necessary to generate the conditions for socialism. So he wouldn't have had any sympathy with the Leninist or Stalinist projects either. So Marx, in this sense, is not against capitalism. What he thinks about capitalism is that it is sawing off the branch it's sitting on over time. That is to say, there are basic contradictions within the way capitalism works, and indeed, the very things that make capitalism the most dynamic and innovative system of production ever to have existed in human history, those very same dynamics ultimately will undermine it. So Marx wants to understand the dynamic processes that bring about capitalism, leads to its maturity, and eventually to its self-destruction. That's the story he wants to tell us. So to point out that Marx saw capitalism as a necessary condition for socialism and for his communist utopia, and also that he admired capitalism for its innovative and dynamic aspect, is not incompatible with saying that Marx saw capitalism as containing these basic contradictions which will lead to its future self-destruction. Pointing that the two aspects of Marx's view of capitalism are not inconsistent is a way of correcting certain very shallow views of Marx as being against capitalism simpliciter. Another contentious thing often said about Marx is that he was in favor of equality, but didn't think much of individual rights and freedom. I already hinted that this is wrong when I said that Marx, as an Enlightenment thinker, was motivated by the idea of individual freedom. In fact, one of Marx's bumper stickers for his communist utopia is "the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all." So he is an egalitarian in the sense that, yes, he wants everybody to have freedom. And he thinks that that is denied to many people in the most common forms of social organization. But freedom is the most important value, and he wants to assure it for everyone. He also thinks that people can't be free unless they are at one with their true selves. And every system of social organization before communism, in his view, makes it impossible for people to be at one with their true selves. We are alienated, according to Marx, from our true natures as productive creatures by the way in which society is organized, and that's the basic problem. We are denied our capacity for free action, according to Marx, and he thinks that we can never realize it until we reach his communist utopia. So, in these lectures, this one and the one that will follow will focus on Marx as an Enlightenment thinker. I want to stress that because, in fact, there is more than one Marx. There are at least two Marxes. If you were taking a course on the history of ideas that had more lectures dedicated to Marx, what we would discover is a lot of attention to his German roots. I've already hinted that he was a disciple and critic of Hegel, the German idealist philosopher, but much of his writing until the mid-19th century was inspired by his critique of Hegel's other followers and disciples, And we're pretty much not going to deal with that. We are not going to focus on young Marx. How is young Marx different from the later Marx or the mature Marx about which we do talk? You may know or not know this, but in the 1830s, when Marx was starting to write about politics, there were revolutions across Europe. Kings and queens were kicked out of office and democracy came to power. Marx and many of those around him thought this is the beginning of the end of capitalism. But by 1832, 1833, all those democratic revolutions had failed, and the monarchies had been restored across Europe. Then in 1848, there was another whole series of revolutions across Europe, and once again, the young Marx thought maybe this is the beginning of the end, and had great faith and optimism that that was going to be the case. But again, by 1851, those revolutions had, again, most of them, failed, and the monarchs were back in power. And Marx, after that, became steadily more skeptical that over his remaining years, he will see a communist revolution. Rather, he invested in the project of trying to understand capitalism in a much more systematic way. What happens in his life is that he was kicked out of Germany, he couldn't go to France, he ended up in London, where he spent his last decades working in the basement of the British Museum. That's where he composed his magnus opus, his 3-volume work, Das Kapital. It was actually envisaged as a 12-volume work, and the only volume that was published during his lifetime was actually volume 1. The second and the third volumes were put together by his friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels. Unfortunately for us, the volumes on politics were never written. So you have to, in a way, put together his mature views about politics from scraps he wrote here and there, and some of the short pieces about politics that do appear in early volumes. Since we are going to focus mainly on the mature Marx, the Marx that was writing in London about capitalism, I want to say something very briefly about the tradition in which Marx was writing. Marx was a follower of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and he saw himself as tackling and refining the theories that they developed. Adam Smith and David Ricardo are the main representative of classical political economists. Understanding the ideas of Das Kapital requires understanding the project of classical political economy and how Marx himself saw the direction in which these theories must be developed. The most important feature of capitalism, as Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, saw it, was the division of labor. The division of labor is important for understanding capitalism for 2 reasons. One, as far as Marx will be concerned, the process of division of labor starts the process of alienating us from ourselves. Why does it do that? It does that because instead of producing things that we then consume, we start producing things in a situation where we divide up tasks, and that makes it impossible for us to live rounded lives. In addition to jump-starting the process of alienation as Marx described it, another more important feature of the division of labor from the point of view of economics is that the division of labor is the engine of productivity. The more you engage in the division of labor, the more productive you make people. Consider Adam Smith's example from The Wealth of Nations of how a pin factory is organized. One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for the receiving head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is another peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. And the important business of making a pin is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations. Smith calculated that by this division of labor, 10 workers could make 48,000 pins a day, but if they all had worked separately and independently, they would have been able to make only a few dozen pins. So the basic insight of Smith is that the division of labor is the engine of capitalist productivity. This sets the terms for Adam Smith's analysis of markets in the wealth of nations, for Ricardo's theory, and for Marx's refinement of both these arguments in Das Kapital. So next, I'll sketch an outline of the project of classical political economy in which Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx were engaged. Introducing the project of classical political economy will give us the chance to also discuss some of the key notions that appear in Das Kapital. These are important for understanding not only the terminology in which Marx was writing and thinking about capitalism and its downfall, but also his broader thoughts on freedom and politics. So what is the project of classical political economy? One way to describe it is as the search for theories of natural and market wages, prices, rents, and profits. So classical political economists wanted to understand what determine wages, prices, rents, and profits. But they also thought you needed two sorts of theories, a theory of natural wages, prices, rents, and profits, and a theory of market wages, prices, rents, and profits. We can focus only on prices because the way the other three categories are treated is basically by analogy to the analysis of pricing. A modern neoclassical economist would say there is only one theory of market, wages, rents, profits, and prices because there is no natural price of anything. What determines prices, according to the neoclassical economists, is supply and demand in the market. There's nothing else to say about prices. So the modern neoclassical economists gave up on the idea of natural prices. Why did classical political economists think that they needed a theory of natural wages or natural prices? The reason they thought there was a theory of natural prices was that they were arguing with people like the physiocrats and the trade theorists about where value comes from. What's the source of value? The physiocrats in France said the source of value is land, that somehow it gets transferred to the product. The trade theorists, who had been impressed by countries like Holland, which had so little land but had become so rich, said, no, value comes from trade. The English theorists, Sir William Petty, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, all believed that the way to find value is to go into labor. Work or workmanship is the source of value. So all classical political economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, believed in the labor theory of value, and they counterposed it to theories based on trade or the physiocrat theories that were popular in France, which claimed that value comes from land. Classical political economists were not ignorant of the laws of supply and demand, but they thought it couldn't possibly tell you the whole story. You can think about it in this way. Suppose there is a low in the supply of coffee mugs, then the price will go up. They didn't disagree with that. If there are too many coffee mugs, more coffee mugs than anybody wants, the price will go down. Classical political economists agree with all that, but they also thought that there must be something that will tell you what the price is when supply and demand are in equilibrium. So what is the natural price or the long-run equilibrium price? A second big problem that framed the project of classical political economy was that they all believed, as they looked around them, that there is a declining tendency in the rate of profit. This was taken as empirical fact. So, a political theory based on economics should explain both where value comes from or where the long-run equilibrium prices come from, but also should explain the declining tendency in the rate of profit. we will get to the details of how Marx himself viewed the problem of the declining tendency in the rate of profit, but for now, it's worth repeating that the main aim of a classical political economical theory was to explain why prices were what they were, and also to give a credible account of the declining tendency in the rate of profit. Adam Smith has an account of this, David Ricardo has one, and Karl Marx has one that partially overlaps with those of Smith and Ricardo's. Before concluding this lecture, I want to introduce a couple more notions that are important for discussing Karl Marx's specific theory of capitalism and the way this fits into the project of classical political economy. I promise not too many key terms. One important conceptual point to make in order to understand the project of classical political economy as Marx understood it concerns the distinction that Marx viewed between use value and exchange value. For Marx, use value is utility. That's all there is to it. Use value is simply usefulness. He also has kind of a binary theory of use value. Either things have use value or they don't. So coffee cups have a use value. You can drink from them. If they have holes in them, they have no use value. Now, when it comes to the important bits of the classical political economy, you need the notion of exchange value or price or value with big V. This is determined by the labor theory of value, which, as we saw, is central to all classical political economy projects. This distinction between use value and exchange value brings us to another important concept for Marx, namely that of a commodity. Commodity is something that's produced for exchange. So, if you plant an apple tree and you grow apples in order to eat them, you're producing for consumption. Those apples are not commodities. But if you plant an apple tree and grow apples and sell them, then those apples are commodities. Something is a commodity if it is produced for exchange. That's very important because once you have a division of labor, you have more and more commodity production. Marx asks about the ultimate consequences of this idea. How would the world look like if commodification was the only game in town? Everything in a capitalist system becomes a commodity, even the worker himself. When you start to understand the dynamics of a capitalist production, we see that the analysis of the value of the worker is no different than the analysis of the value of the pin that gets produced in Adam Smith's factory. To start with, Marx thinks we have to understand how capitalist system looks from the inside, namely to the participants. He thinks this is important because the way it looks to the participants, it's not, or it shouldn't necessarily be, the way in which it works. So for Marx, there is a basic distinction between appearance and reality. Appearance refers to how capitalism looks to the participants, what the participants are able to say about how the market works, and reality refers to how the system, capitalist system, actually works. As a figure of an enlightenment, Marx thinks he's describing scientifically the laws of motion of the capitalist system, regardless of whether the participants in those systems understand these laws of motion or not. And for the most part, they don't. Indeed, he's going to ultimately claim that what distinguishes a socialist revolution that leads to the communist utopia is that for the first time in history, people understand the social relations that they're a part of, and so they can self-consciously transform them and create an unalienated social order. So, at the beginning of his magnum opus, Das Kapital, Marx asks, how does it look to the participants? Well, if you have a division of labor, you look around, what do you see? You see people producing commodities. They exchange those commodities for money, and then they use that money to buy other commodities, which they consume. So you have these cycles of exchange, commodity, money, commodity. The person working growing apples sells the apples for money and then uses the money to buy milk and eggs and so on. This is the simplest case. But then Marx says, if you look a little bit more carefully, you see that actually some people are doing something different. It's true, most people produce commodities. They exchange commodities for money and they use the money to buy other commodities. They consume. But some people are taking some money, buying a commodity, in this case, the labor of a worker for a given period of time, and then selling what gets produced for more money. So they don't seem to be interested in consumption at all at first glance. If you look even more closely, you'll see that when they do that, the money they end up with is more than the money they started with. And the question, the big question, the organizing question of Das Kapital is, where does this extra money come from? What makes profit possible? You are not going to be able to explain why profits decline or why prices are what they are if you can't understand where profit comes from. What is the origin of profit? That is the basic problem.